the tranquil village of Danefield, a single cup of cocoa turns deadly, shattering the peace of a genteel tea party. When charming newcomer Lawrence Vane collapses, poisoned, in Danefield Manor, Miss Jane Marple's keen eyes see beyond the shock. A nervous widow, a secretive maid, a hidden vial of cyanide, and a letter from a shadowy past unravel a web of fear and betrayal. As whispers of old grudges and stolen fortune surface, Miss Marple pieces together a chilling truth. The killer is closer than anyone dares to think. In this Agatha Christie-style mystery, every glance hides a secret, and one fatal sip changes everything. Chapter 1. The quiet village of Danefield. The village of Danefield lay cradled in a fold of the English countryside. Its thatched cottages and winding lanes undisturbed by the clamour of the modern world. Autumn had painted the hedgerows with splashes of russet and gold, and a brisk wind carried the scent of wood smoke through the air. In her modest cottage on Willow Lane, Miss Jane Marple sat by her window, her fingers deftly guiding knitting needles through a pattern of soft grey wool. Her eyes, bright and perceptive behind her spectacles, occasionally drifted to the street, where villagers passed with the predictable rhythm of a long-established routine. Miss Marple, a spinster of advancing years but undiminished acuity, had made Danefield her home for decades. She knew the habits of her neighbours as intimately as she knew the stitches of her latest shawl. The butcher's boy who lingered too long at the baker's, the postmistress's penchant for misdelivering letters, the quiet rivalries over prize marrows at the annual fete. These were the threads of village life she wove into her understanding. Human nature, she often thought, is much the same, whether in Danefield or Delhi. On this particular morning, a letter arrived, its crisp envelope bearing the crest of Danefield Manor. Miss Marple opened it with care, noting the elegant handwriting of Mrs. Eleanor Price, a widow who had taken up residence at the manor 6 months prior. The note invited her to tea that afternoon, a small gathering to introduce Mr. Lawrence Vane, a newcomer to the village. Mrs. Price's tone was formal, yet there was a faint urgency beneath the polite words, as if the occasion carried more weight than a mere social call. Miss Marple set the letter aside, her mind already turning. She had heard of Mr. Vane, of course. Danefield was not a place where newcomers went unnoticed. A bachelor of means, recently returned from South America, he had taken a lease on Rose Cottage, a charming but secluded property on the edge of the village. Whispers spoke of his wealth, his charm, and his curious habit of importing fine cocoa, which he drank daily with almost ritualistic devotion. A man with a taste for cocoa, Miss Marple mused, is often particular about other things. She rose, smoothing her tweed skirt, and prepared for the new visit. Her black brogues, polished to a gleam, carried her along Willow Lane towards the manor. The path wound past the church, where Mr. Clement, the vicar, was tending to a rose bush, and the village shop, where Miss Lavinia Blake's voice could be heard expounding on the price of tea. Miss Marple nodded politely to passers-by, her unassuming demeanour masking the sharp observation that catalogued every detail. The slight limp in old Mr. Grayson's step, the hurried glance of the manor's maid, Clara, as she carried a basket toward the market. Danefield Manor stood at the end of a gravel drive, its ivy-clad walls exuding an air of faded grandeur. Mrs. Price had restored much of its elegance, though Miss Marple noted the uneven pruning of the topiary, a sign of the widow's distracted state. As she approached, the heavy oak door opened and Mrs. Price herself appeared, her face pale but composed. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to come," she said, her voice betraying a faint tremor. "Do come in. The others are already here." The drawing-room was warm and inviting, its fireplace crackling softly. The gathered company included Mr. Clement, whose earnest face was framed by a slightly askew clerical collar. His young wife, Griselda, whose vibrant energy seemed at odds with the room's sombre mood. Dr. Haydock, the village physician, whose practical air was tempered by a wry smile, and Miss Blake, whose eager eyes darted about, hungry for gossip. At the centre stood Mr. Lawrence Vane, tall and impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, his dark hair flecked with silver. His smile was warm, yet Miss Marple detected a guarded quality in his gaze, as if he were measuring the room. "Miss Marple," he said, extending a hand, "I've heard you're the heart of Dainfield's wisdom." His voice carried a trace of an accent, softened by years abroad. She smiled demurely. "People exaggerate, Mr. Vane. I'm merely an old woman who enjoys a quiet life." The conversation turned to village matters, the upcoming harvest festival, the state of the church roof. But Miss Marple's attention lingered on Mrs. Price. The widow moved restlessly, adjusting a vase here, a cushion there, her eyes flicking toward Mr. Vane with an intensity that spoke of more than casual acquaintance. When the maid, Clara, entered with a tray of cocoa, the room fell briefly silent. The aroma was rich, almost intoxicating, and Mr. Vane's face lit up. "My own blend," he said proudly, lifting his cup. "There's nothing quite like it." Miss Marple accepted her cup, noting the slight tremor in Clara's hand as she served. Mrs. Price watched the tray with an odd fixation, her fingers twisting a lace handkerchief. The cocoa was indeed exceptional, smooth and faintly bitter, but Miss Marple drank sparingly. She had learned long ago to trust her instincts when something felt amiss. As the afternoon wore on, Mr. Vane spoke of his travels, mines in Peru, markets in Chiriu, Buenos Aires, with a storyteller's flair. Yet Miss Marple sensed an undercurrent, a story left untold. She recalled a young man from her youth, a traveller who had returned with secrets that unravelled a village. The past, she thought, her needles clicking softly in her lap, has a way of catching up. Chapter 2. The Gathering at Dainfield Manor. The drawing-room of Dainfield Manor glowed with the soft light of late afternoon, its heavy velvet drapes framing tall windows that overlooked the autumnal gardens. A fire crackled in the grate, casting flickering shadows across the polished mahogany furniture and the delicate porcelain cups arranged on a silver tray. The air was thick with the rich, almost exotic scent of cocoa, a beverage that seemed to Miss Jane Marple both luxurious and slightly out of place in the modest village of Dainfield. She sat in a high-backed chair, her knitting resting lightly in her lap, her eyes moving from face to face with the quiet attentiveness of one who saw more than she spoke. Mrs. Eleanor Price, the hostess, stood near the fireplace, her posture rigid despite the welcoming smile she forced. Her dark dress, though elegant, seemed to weigh her down, and her hands fluttered nervously as she introduced the guests. "I thought it only proper," she said, her voice a touch too bright, "to welcome Mr. Vane to Dainfield with a small gathering." Her eyes darted to the man in question, who stood with an easy confidence near the centre of the room, his tailored suit and polished shoes marking him as a man accustomed to finer circles than those of a country village. Mr. Lawrence Vane, the newcomer, was a striking figure, tall, with a lean frame and dark hair just beginning to silver at the temples. His smile was disarming, yet Miss Marple noted a certain wariness in his eyes, as if he were perpetually assessing his surroundings. "You're all too kind," he said, his voice smooth with a faint trace of an accent, perhaps South American, softened by years of travel. "Danefield is a charming respite after my years abroad. I hope to settle here for a time." The other guests formed a small but varied circle. Mr. Clement, the vicar, sat with his hands clasped, his earnest face betraying a mild discomfort at the formality of the occasion. His wife, Griselda, a vivacious young woman with a penchant for bright scarves, perched on the edge of her chair, her eyes sparkling with curiosity. Dr. Haydock, the village physician, leaned back with a sceptical air, his weathered face suggesting a man who had seen much and believed little. Miss Lavinia Blake, Danefield's self-appointed chronicler of gossip, sat with a notebook disguised as a prayer book, her pen poised to capture any stray remark. Miss Marple, unobtrusive in her corner, observed them all, her mind weaving connections as deftly as her needles wove wool. The conversation began with the predictable pleasantries of village life, the success of the recent fete, the need for repairs to the church hall, the unseasonable chill in the air. Mrs. Price, however, seemed distracted, her responses brief and her gaze returning repeatedly to Mr. Vane. Miss Marple, ever sensitive to such nuances, recalled a similar tension in a young woman from her youth, whose nervous glances had hidden a secret that later unravelled a tragedy. There is something here, she thought, something unspoken. The arrival of the cocoa interrupted her musings. Clara, the young maid, entered with a tray bearing a silver pot and a set of delicate cups. Her movements were precise but hurried, and Miss Marple noted a faint flush on her cheeks, as if the task carried an unusual weight. Mr. Vane's face lit up at the sight of the pot. "My own blend," he announced, stepping forward to assist Clara. "I brought it from Peru, a particular bean, roasted to perfection. You'll find nothing like it in England." His enthusiasm was infectious, and the guests murmured their appreciation as the cups were distributed. Mrs. Price poured the cocoa herself, her hands steady, but her eyes flickering with something Miss Marple could not quite place. Apprehension, perhaps, or reluctance. Each guest received a cup, the dark liquid steaming gently, its aroma filling the room with a heady warmth. Mr. Vane raised his cup in a mock toast. "To new beginnings," he said, his smile broadening. He drank deeply, savouring the taste with a connoisseur's relish. The others sipped more cautiously, Miss Marple among them, her small sip revealing a flavour both rich and slightly bitter, unlike any cocoa she had tasted before. The conversation resumed, turning to Mr. Vane's travels. He spoke of bustling markets in Lima, treacherous mountain passes, and the thrill of discovering rare cacao plantations. His stories were vivid, yet Miss Marple sensed a careful omission, as if he were curating his past for his audience. She glanced at Mrs. Price, whose smile had grown strained, and at Clara, who lingered near the door, her eyes fixed on Vane with an intensity that seemed out of place for a servant. It was then that the moment came. Mr. Vane paused mid-sentence, his hand tightening around his cup. A shadow crossed his face, and his breath caught audibly. He began, but the word dissolved into a gasp. His free hand clutched at his chest, his eyes wide with sudden terror. The cup slipped from his fingers, shattering on the floor, the dark cocoa pooling like ink. He staggered, then collapsed, his body crumpling onto the Persian rug with a dull thud. For a heartbeat, the room was frozen. Then chaos erupted. Griselda cried out, her scarf slipping to the floor. Mr. Clement leapt to his feet, knocking over a small table. Miss Blake gasped, her pen dropping from her hand. Dr. Haydock, with the calm of a man accustomed to emergencies, knelt beside Vane, his fingers searching for a pulse. "He's gone," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the clamour. "Dead!" Mrs. Price stood rooted by the fireplace, her face ashen, her handkerchief twisted into a knot. "No," she whispered, "it can't be." Clara, still by the door, seemed to shrink into herself, her hands trembling. Miss Marple, her knitting undisturbed, watched them all, her mind racing. She had seen death before, too often perhaps, but there was something deliberate in this scene, something that spoke of intent rather than accident. Dr. Haydock straightened, his expression grim. "We must call the police," he said, "and no one is to touch anything." He glanced at the shattered cup, the spilled cocoa already soaking into the rug. Miss Marple's eyes followed his, noting the faint sheen of the liquid, the way it seemed to cling to the shards. Poison, she thought, though she did not say it aloud. She recalled a case from years ago, a tea party in St. Mary Mead, where a single cup had carried death. "It is always the small things," she mused, "the way a cup is offered or refused." As Mr. Clement hurried to the telephone, Miss Marple's gaze lingered on Mrs. Price, whose hands now clutched the mantel as if for support. Clara slipped out of the room, her departure unnoticed by all but Miss Marple. Miss Blake, recovering her composure, began to whisper speculations to Griselda, who nodded absently, her eyes still fixed on Vane's lifeless form. Dr. Haydock remained by the body, his face unreadable, but his hands steady as he covered Vane with a shawl from a nearby chair. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, a rhythm as steady as her thoughts. She had seen the glances, the hesitations, the subtle shifts in posture. Someone in this room knew more than they would say. Human nature, she thought, is never so simple as it seems. As the distant wail of a police car approached, she settled back, her sharp eyes missing nothing, her mind already piecing together the fragments of a puzzle that had only just begun to form. Chapter 3. The Shadow of Poison. The drawing room of Danefield Manor, so recently a scene of polite civility, now bore the stark air of a crime scene. The fire had dwindled to glowing embers, and the autumn light filtering through the tall windows cast long, mournful shadows across the polished floor. Lawrence Vane's body lay covered by Dr. Haydock's shawl, the broken shards of his cocoa cup glinting ominously in the fading glow. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly in her corner, her knitting needles idle for once, her eyes moving with unhurried precision over the faces of those around her. Shock hung heavy in the air, but beneath it she sensed something sharper, guilt perhaps, or fear. Mrs. Eleanor Price stood by the mantel, her face drained of colour, her fingers clutching a crumpled lace handkerchief, as if it were a lifeline. The vicar, Mr. Clement, hovered near the door, his usual composure frayed, while Griselda, his wife, sat wide-eyed, her bright scarf a jarring note against the room's sombre mood. Miss Lavinia Blake, ever the observer, scribbled furtively in her notebook, her lips pursed with the thrill of scandal. Dr. Haydock, having done what he could, stood with arms crossed, his practical mind already turning to the next steps. Clara, the maid, had vanished shortly after the police were called, a detail Miss Marple tucked away for later consideration. The arrival of Inspector Craddock broke the strained silence. A tall man with a methodical air, he carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to unravelling mysteries. He had crossed paths with Miss Marple before, in circumstances not dissimilar, and his sharp glance toward her held a flicker of respect. "Miss Marple," he said with a nod before turning to the room, "no one is to leave until we've taken statements. Dr. Haydock, your initial thoughts?" The doctor cleared his throat. "Poison, almost certainly," he said, his voice steady but grave. "The symptoms, sudden collapse, convulsions, the pallor, point to something fast-acting. Likely cyanide, though we'll need the coroner's report to confirm." He gestured to the shattered cup. "The cocoa is the obvious culprit. It should be analysed at once." Inspector Craddock nodded, signalling to a constable to secure the cup and its spilled contents. "Mrs. Price," he said, turning to the widow, "you prepared the cocoa, I understand?" Mrs. Price flinched, her eyes darting to the floor. "Yes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Vane insisted on using his own blend. He brought it from South America, he said. I only followed his instructions." Her words faltered, and she pressed the handkerchief to her lips. Miss Marple's gaze softened, but her mind was alert. She noted the hesitation in Mrs. Price's voice, the way her hands trembled not with grief, but with something closer to dread. Fear, Miss Marple thought, is a powerful telltale. But fear of what? She recalled a case from her youth, a vicarage tea where a young wife's trembling hands had betrayed a secret far darker than anyone suspected. The inspector moved methodically, questioning each guest. Mr. Clement admitted to drinking only a sip, finding the cocoa too bitter for his taste. Griselda, with her characteristic candour, declared it rather odd, but had finished her cup out of politeness. Miss Blake, ever eager to insert herself, claimed she'd barely touched hers, her attention too fixed on Mr. Vane's tales of adventure. Dr. Haydock confirmed he'd taken a small amount, with no ill effects. Miss Marple, when asked, said simply, "I sipped it, Inspector. It was distinctive." Her mild tone belied the sharpness of her observation. No one else had shown symptoms, which suggested the poison was in Vane's cup alone. As the constable bagged the cocoa pot and cups, Inspector Craddock turned to Mrs. Price. "Who handled the cocoa before it was served?" "Only myself and Clara," she replied, her voice steadier now. "Clara brought the tray, but I poured the cups. Mr. Vane was particular about how it was prepared." She paused, then added, "He watched me closely." Miss Marple's needles twitched slightly, though she did not pick them up. Watched closely, she thought. Was he suspicious, or merely fastidious? She filed the detail away, alongside the memory of Clara's flushed cheeks and hurried exit. The inspector's men searched Vane's belongings, brought from Rose Cottage at his request for his stay at the manor. Among them was a tin of his prized cocoa, its label in Spanish, and a letter, half crumpled, tucked inside a coat pocket. Craddock read it aloud to the group, his tone neutral. "You cannot run forever, Vane. The mine is not yours to claim." It was unsigned, but the postmark was from Lima, dated 3 months prior. A murmur rippled through the room, and Miss Blake's pen scratched furiously. "A business dispute, perhaps," Craddock said, folding the letter. "Mr. Vane's wealth came from South American ventures, I understand. We'll look into this." He glanced at Mrs. Price, whose face had grown even paler. "Anything you'd care to add, Mrs. Price, about Mr. Vane's past?" She shook her head quickly. "I barely knew him," she said. "We met briefly in London, years ago, before my marriage. Nothing more." Her voice was firm, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of something, memory perhaps, or regret. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her expression one of gentle concern. "It's so difficult, isn't it, Mrs. Price, when the past comes calling unexpectedly?" Her tone was kind, but her words carried a subtle probe. Mrs. Price's lips parted, but she said nothing, her gaze dropping to the floor. The inspector dismissed the guests for the moment, asking them to remain in Danefield pending further inquiries. As they dispersed, Miss Marple lingered, her eyes resting on the spot where Vane had fallen. She recalled a village scandal from years past, where a poisoned glass of sherry had been meant for one, but taken by another. "The cup," she murmured to herself, "is never the whole story." Outside, the autumn dusk had settled, cloaking the manor in a soft grey haze. Miss Marple walked slowly down the gravel drive, her mind turning over the scene she had just witnessed. The letter from Lima suggested enemies abroad, but the poison in the cocoa spoke of someone closer. Someone in this very room, perhaps. Mrs. Price's nervousness, Clara's swift departure, the guarded looks among the guests, all were pieces of a puzzle that did not yet fit. As she reached Willow Lane, she paused by the churchyard, where the vicar's roses stood sentinel in the fading light. A sudden memory surfaced. A young man in St. Mary Mead, poisoned by a bitter draught, meant to silence a secret. Poison, Miss Marple thought, is a coward's weapon, but a clever one. She resolved to speak with Clara, whose behaviour struck her as more than mere shock. And Mrs. Price, her connection to Vane, however brief, warranted closer scrutiny. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple lit a lamp and resumed her knitting, the soft click of the needles a counterpoint to her racing thoughts. "It is always the little things," she said softly to her cat Pippin, who blinked at her from the hearth. A glance, a tremor, a letter left carelessly in a pocket. They tell us everything if we only listen. Chapter 4. Whispers of the Past. The morning after Lawrence Vane's death, Danefield awoke to a subdued hum of speculation. The village, usually content with the gentle ebb of daily routines, now buzzed with hushed voices in the shop, the post office, and the narrow lanes where neighbours lingered longer than usual. Miss Jane Marple, stepping out from her cottage on Willow Lane, felt the weight of the village's unease. Her black hat was tilted just so, her basket swinging lightly as she made her way to the vicarage. Ostensibly to discuss the harvest festival, but with a mind attuned to deeper currents. The air was crisp, the hedgerows glistening with dew, and Miss Marple's sharp eyes noted the small signs of disruption. A knot of villagers near the church, whispering as they glanced toward Danefield Manor. The hurried step of the postman, who carried more than letters today. She recalled a similar mood in a village long ago, when a sudden death had unravelled secrets hidden beneath polite smiles. Gossip, she thought, is a crude tool, but it often points to the truth. At the vicarage, Griselda Clement greeted her with a burst of energy, her auburn curls escaping their pins as she ushered Miss Marple into the sitting room. "Oh, Miss Marple, isn't it dreadful?" she exclaimed, pouring tea with a clatter of cups. "Poor Mr. Vane, and at Eleanor's tea of all places. Everyone's talking, you know. They say he made enemies in South America. Something about a mine gone wrong." Mr. Clement, entering with an armful of parish papers, looked weary. "Griselda, we mustn't spread rumours," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. He turned to Miss Marple, his face earnest. "It's shaken the village, I'm afraid. Mrs. Price hasn't left the manor since yesterday, and I hear the police are still there." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression one of mild interest. "It is unsettling," she agreed, "but I find people often reveal more in their silences than in their words." She paused, then added casually, "You mentioned once, Griselda, that Mrs. Price and Mr. Vane met in London years ago. Was there anything particular about it?" Griselda's eyes widened, delighted to share. "Oh, yes. I heard it from Miss Blake, who heard it from Mrs. Price's old cook. It was before Eleanor married Mr. Price. Some society event, I think. Vane was quite the charmer then, they say, but he left for South America soon after. Broke a few hearts, I shouldn't wonder." She laughed, then sobered. "Eleanor never mentioned it herself, though. Odd, isn't it?" Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning over this fragment. A broken heart, she knew, could fester into something darker, though Mrs. Price's nervous demeanour suggested fear more than vengeance. "People do change," she said softly, "but the past has a way of lingering." That afternoon, under the pretence of returning a borrowed shawl, Miss Marple called at Danefield Manor. Mrs. Price received her in the morning room, a smaller space than the grand drawing room, its walls lined with books and a single photograph in a silver frame. The widow looked drawn, her eyes shadowed, her hands twisting a silk scarf. "Miss Marple," she said, forcing a smile, "how kind of you to come. I'm afraid I'm not myself today." "Quite understandable," Miss Marple replied, settling into a chair. "Such a shock, and in your home. You managed so well under the circumstances." Her tone was gentle, but her eyes flicked to the photograph, half hidden behind a clock. It showed a younger Mrs. Price, radiant in a ball gown, beside a man whose features bore a striking resemblance to Lawrence Vane. "A lovely picture," she remarked. "From happier times, perhaps." Mrs. Price's hand froze on the scarf. "Oh, that," she said quickly, "just an old memory. London, long ago." She rose to adjust the clock, obscuring the photograph, and changed the subject to the weather. Miss Marple did not press, but her mind catalogued the moment. "She hides him," she thought, "but why?" She recalled a woman in her youth, whose denial of a past love had masked a motive for murder. As she took her leave, she noted Clara, the maid, polishing silver in the hall, her movements mechanical, her eyes darting toward her mistress with a mix of deference and something else. Resentment, perhaps. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting resumed but her thoughts elsewhere. The photograph suggested a connection deeper than Mrs. Price admitted, yet her fear seemed genuine, not the mark of a killer. The letter found in Vane's pocket, with its hint of a South American grudge, pointed to a wider net of suspects. And Clara, her behaviour at the tea, her quick exit, her flushed intensity merited closer attention. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Miss Lavinia Blake, her face alight with the thrill of news, bustled in. "Miss Marple, you'll never guess. she said, barely pausing for breath. "They're saying Vane's money came from a mining deal in Peru, but it wasn't all above board. Some partner of his was cheated, and there's talk it ruined him. Do you think it's connected?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "People do talk, don't they? But I find the truth often lies in what they don't say." She offered Miss Blake tea, steering the conversation to safer topics, but her mind lingered on the mining dispute. A cheated partner, a letter from Lima, a poisoned cup. Each was a thread in a tapestry not yet complete. As evening fell, Miss Marple lit a lamp and took up her knitting, the soft click of needles a counterpoint to her racing thoughts. She recalled a village scandal from years past, where a jilted lover had waited patiently for revenge, striking when least expected. "Motives," she murmured to Pippin, her cat who dozed by the hearth, "are like shadows. They shift depending on the light." Mrs. Price's past with Vane, Clara's strange behaviour, the ominous letter, all pointed to secrets buried but not forgotten. She resolved to speak with Inspector Craddock, to share just enough to nudge his inquiries without revealing the full scope of her suspicions. Outside, Danefield settled into the quiet of an autumn night, but Miss Marple knew the calm was deceptive. Somewhere, someone held the key to Lawrence Vane's death, and she was determined to find it, one careful stitch at a time. Chapter 5. The Vicar's Discovery. The morning sun broke through a veil of mist over Danefield, casting a pale light on the village's thatched roofs and dew-soaked lanes. Miss Jane Marple, ever an early riser, sat at her breakfast table with a cup of tea, her gaze drifting to the garden where sparrows darted among the rose bushes. The events at Danefield Manor lingered in her mind, each detail a thread in a pattern not yet fully woven. She had seen death before, too often perhaps, but the suddenness of Lawrence Vane's collapse, the bitter scent of his cocoa, and the undercurrents of tension among the guests spoke of a puzzle that demanded patience to unravel. Her musings were interrupted by a knock at the door. Mr. Clement, the vicar, stood on her doorstep, his face etched with unease. His clerical collar was slightly askew, and his hands fidgeted with a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice low, "I'm sorry to disturb you so early, but I've found something troubling. May I come in?" "Of course," she replied, ushering him into the sitting room. She noted the strain in his expression, the way his eyes darted to the window as if expecting to be watched. "You look quite shaken, Mr. Clement. Has something happened?" He sat heavily, placing the parcel on the table. "Yesterday evening, after evensong, I was tending to the churchyard, clearing leaves from the path near the yew trees. I found this." He unwrapped the paper to reveal a small glass vial, no larger than a thimble, with traces of a crystalline residue clinging to its interior. It was half buried under the hedge near the gate to Danefield Manor. I didn't touch it directly, but it looked suspicious. Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes sharp behind her spectacles. "Suspicious indeed," she said softly. "Have you shown this to Inspector Craddock?" "I took it to him at once," Mr. Clement said. "He sent it for analysis, but he believes it may be connected to Mr. Vane's death. The residue, he said, could be cyanide." His voice faltered. "To think such a thing was hidden in our churchyard, Miss Marple. It's unthinkable." She nodded, her mind racing. Cyanide, fast-acting and deadly, matched Dr. Haydock's assessment of Vane's symptoms. The vial's location so close to the manor suggested a hasty disposal, perhaps by someone fleeing the scene. "It's curious," she said, her tone mild, "how people choose their hiding places. A churchyard is sacred ground, but it's also quiet, easily overlooked." She recalled a case from her youth, where a stolen brooch had been found beneath a gravestone, discarded in panic. "Did you see anyone near the churchyard that evening?" Mr. Clement shook his head. "No one, though it was growing dark. The manor's staff use that path sometimes. It's a shortcut to the village. Clara, the maid, often passes that way." Miss Marple's needles resting in her lap twitched slightly. Clara again. The maid's behaviour at the tea, her flushed cheeks, her swift exit, had not escaped her notice. "Thank you, Mr. Clement," she said. "You've done well to bring this to the police. Such discoveries often lead us closer to the truth." After the vicar left, Miss Marple walked to the village shop, her basket swinging lightly. The shop was a hub of gossip, and she knew Miss Lavinia Blake would be there, eager to share the latest whispers. Sure enough, Miss Blake was at the counter, her voice animated as she spoke to the shopkeeper. "They say the police found something in the churchyard," she said, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "A bottle, or some such thing. It's all to do with that dreadful cocoa, I'm sure." Miss Marple approached, her smile disarming. "Good morning, Miss Blake. The village is quite stirred up, isn't it? I heard something about a delivery to the manor, a chemical, perhaps for cleaning." Miss Blake's eyes gleamed. "Oh, you've heard?" "Yes, the delivery boy mentioned Mrs. Price ordered something unusual last week." "For silver polish," she said, "but it was an odd sort, not the usual kind. I thought it peculiar, but then she's been so distracted lately." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of polite interest. "Silver polish," she murmured. "How curious." She knew, as any practical woman would, that cyanide had no place in polishing silver. The detail slotted into her mental tapestry, alongside the vial, the letter from Lima, and Mrs. Price's nervous glances. "People do make strange choices under pressure," she added, her tone light, but her mind alert. That afternoon, Miss Marple sat with Inspector Craddock at the police station, a small building on the village's edge. He confirmed the vial's contents. Traces of potassium cyanide, enough to kill, swiftly if ingested. "It's a strong lead," he said, his brow furrowed. "The vial was found too close to the manor to be coincidence. Someone wanted it out of sight quickly." Miss Marple tilted her head. "And the cocoa tin, Inspector?" "Mr. Vane's special blend." "Still being tested," he replied. "No traces of poison in the pot or the other cups, which points to Vane's cup being tampered with directly. Mrs. Price poured it, and Clara handled the tray. We're looking into both." She nodded, her eyes distant. "It's the little things, Inspector, that often tell the story. A hand that lingers, a cup placed just so." She paused, then added, "Clara seemed quite agitated at the tea. Young girls, you know, can be impulsive when frightened." Craddock raised an eyebrow, accustomed to her subtle hints. "I'll speak to her again," he said. "She's been evasive, but nothing concrete yet." As Miss Marple walked home, her thoughts turned to the vial's hiding place. The churchyard was a bold choice, yet a desperate one. Too near the manor for true concealment, too exposed for carelessness. She recalled a village lad from years past, who had hidden stolen coins in a flower bed, only to be caught when the gardener turned the soil. Fear makes us clumsy, she thought. That evening she sat by her fire, her knitting a soft rhythm against her thoughts. The vial pointed to someone with access to the manor, someone who knew Vane's habits. Mrs. Price's order of a chemical was troubling, yet her fear seemed too raw for guilt. Clara, however, remained an enigma. Her intensity, her quick departure, her use of the churchyard path. And the letter from Lima hinted at enemies beyond Danefield's borders, perhaps tied to Vane's mining ventures. Miss Marple's needles paused as she considered another possibility. Someone else at the tea, unnoticed in the chaos. Dr. Hoddock, with his medical knowledge, had access to chemicals, though his demeanour suggested no malice. Miss Blake's gossip was tiresome but harmless, and Griselda's scatterbrained nature made her an unlikely plotter. Mr. Clement, earnest to a fault, seemed beyond suspicion. Yet someone had slipped cyanide into Vane's cup, and the answer lay in the subtle details she had yet to unravel. As Pippin curled up beside her, Miss Marple murmured, "It's always the unexpected, isn't it? The quiet ones, the overlooked ones who surprise us most." She resolved to watch Clara closely and to probe Mrs. Price's past with Vane further. The truth, she knew, was buried in the shadows of Danefield's quiet lanes, waiting for her to bring it to light. Chapter 6. A Secret Unveiled. The village of Danefield, though outwardly serene under a pale October sky, thrummed with an undercurrent of unease. The death of Lawrence Vane had stirred the quiet lanes, and whispers of poison and hidden grudges passed from doorstep to doorstep like an ill wind. Miss Jane Marple, stepping lightly along Willow Lane, carried her basket with an air of purpose. Her morning had been spent in thought, piecing together the fragments of the tragedy at Danefield Manor. The vial of cyanide, the letter from Lima, Mrs. Price's guarded demeanour, and Clara's furtive behaviour formed a pattern, but one piece was still missing. A motive clear enough to point to the hand that had poisoned Vane's cocoa. At the police station, Inspector Craddock greeted her with a nod, his desk strewn with papers and a tin of Vane's cocoa, now sealed in evidence. "Miss Marple," he said, a hint of weariness in his voice, "your instincts are uncanny. We've had a development." He produced a document, its edges creased from travel. "Vane's solicitor sent this over, a copy of his will, drawn up just before he returned to England." Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles, her eyes keen. "A will, Inspector? That often tells us more than people intend." Craddock nodded. "Vane left a sizable sum to Mrs. Price, provided she remains unmarried. The rest goes to a distant cousin in Canada. It's unusual, given Mrs. Price claims they were barely acquainted." The news settled in Miss Marple's mind like a new stitch in her knitting. "Unusual indeed," she said softly. "A legacy like that suggests a connection deeper than a passing meeting in London." She recalled a case from her youth, where a bequest to an old friend had masked a tangled history of promises and betrayals. "Have you spoken to Mrs. Price about this?" "I have," Craddock replied. "She was shaken, claimed she had no idea about the will. But she admitted to an engagement with Vane years ago, before he left for South America. It ended abruptly when he departed. She says there was no ill will, but—" He trailed off, his expression sceptical. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. "Broken engagements leave scars, Inspector, even if they're not spoken of. But Mrs. Price's fear strikes me as genuine, not the mark of a schemer." Her mind turned to the photograph she had glimpsed in the manor, the young Eleanor beside a man resembling Vane. A past romance, perhaps, but one that lingered in ways yet unclear. That afternoon, Miss Marple visited the manor again, this time with a small jar of her homemade damson jam as an excuse. Mrs. Price received her in the morning room, her face pale but composed. "You're very kind, Miss Marple," she said, setting the jam on a side table. "I'm afraid I'm not much company today. The police, the questions, it's all so overwhelming." "I quite understand," Miss Marple replied, her tone gentle. "It must be difficult, especially with such an unexpected connection to Mr. Vane. A will is such a personal thing, isn't it?" She watched Mrs. Price closely, noting the slight tightening of her hands. The widow's eyes widened, then dropped to her lap. "I didn't know," she said quickly. "I swear, Lawrence, Mr. Vane, was part of my life so briefly. We were engaged, yes, but it was a youthful fancy. He left for Peru, and I married Mr. Price soon after. I thought that chapter closed." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of quiet sympathy. "Of course, but it's curious how the past can resurface, isn't it? Like a letter found in a pocket, or a photograph tucked away." She let the words hang, and Mrs. Price's gaze flickered to the clock, where the photograph remained hidden. As she took her leave, Miss Marple's attention shifted to Clara, who was polishing a brass candlestick in the hall. The maid's movements were brisk, almost frantic, and her eyes darted toward the door as if expecting an interruption. Miss Marple paused, her voice soft. "Clara, you must be terribly shaken by all this. Serving the cocoa that day, such a dreadful burden for a young girl." Clara's hands stilled, and a flush crept up her neck. "I only did as I was told, miss," she said, her voice tight. "Mrs. Price poured the cups. I just carried the tray." She turned away, resuming her work with exaggerated focus. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Fear again, she thought, but fear of discovery, or something else. She recalled a housemaid from years past, whose nervous manner had hidden a theft, not a murder. Yet Clara's intensity suggested a deeper secret. That evening, as twilight settled over Danefield, Miss Marple took a stroll along the lane behind the manor, where a footpath wound toward the churchyard. She moved slowly, her eyes scanning the ground for anything overlooked. Near the hedge, where the vial had been found, she paused, her thoughts on Clara's frequent use of this path. A sudden movement caught her eye. A figure slipping through the dusk, moving towards the village. It was Clara, her shawl pulled tight, meeting a young man in the shadow of an oak. Miss Marple recognized him as Tom Reed, Dr. Haydock's assistant, a quiet lad with a reputation for reliability. She kept her distance, her steps silent on the grass. Their voices were low, but fragments reached her. "Can't keep quiet forever. And he knew, Clara, he knew." The urgency in their tones was unmistakable. Miss Marple retreated, her mind racing. Tom Reed had access to medical supplies, perhaps even cyanide. And Clara, her connection to Vane, if any, remained unclear, but her agitation pointed to involvement. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting untouched. The will, the engagement, Clara's meeting with Tom Reed. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture was still blurred. She recalled a village scandal where a young couple, driven by desperation, had acted rashly to protect a shared secret. "Clara and Tom," she murmured to Pippin, who blinked lazily from the hearth. What did Vane know about them? She resolved to share her observations with Inspector Craddock, but carefully. She had learned long ago that the police preferred facts to intuitions, however well-founded. The will suggested a motive for Mrs. Price, yet her fear seemed to absolve her. Clara, however, was a different matter. Her youth, her intensity, her connection to Tom Reed, all pointed to a secret worth killing for. As the clock chimed 9, Miss Marple took up her knitting, the soft click of needles a steady counterpoint to her thoughts. "It's the quiet ones," she said softly, "who often carry the heaviest burdens." Tomorrow, she would urge Craddock to search Clara's room and perhaps Tom Reed's lodgings. The truth, she sensed, was close, hidden in the shadows of Danefield's tranquil lanes. Chapter 7. The fatal truth. The pale light of an October dawn crept over Danefield, softening the sharp edges of the village's thatched roofs and casting long shadows across the dew-laden grass. Miss Jane Marple sat by her cottage window, her tea cooling as she turned over the threads of the mystery that had gripped the village. The vial of cyanide, the cryptic letter from Lima, Mrs. Price's hidden past, and Clara's clandestine meeting with Tom Reed formed a tapestry of suspicion, yet the final stitch, the truth of Lawrence Vane's death, remained elusive. Miss Marple's eyes, bright with purpose, lingered on the lane outside, where the milkman's cart rattled past, a reminder of the village's deceptively ordinary rhythm. Her morning walk took her to the police station, where Inspector Craddock was sorting through reports, his face etched with the strain of a case that refused to yield easily. "Miss Marple," he greeted her, a flicker of anticipation in his eyes. "I was about to send for you. We've had a breakthrough, thanks to your suggestion about Clara." Miss Marple settled into a chair, her hands folded neatly over her basket. "Oh, Inspector, I merely thought it prudent to look closer at those nearest the scene. What have you found?" Craddock produced a small envelope, its edges worn, and slid it across the desk. This was in Clara's room, hidden beneath a loose floorboard. "It's a letter from Vane, addressed to her." He read aloud, his voice steady. "Clara, you thought you could hide in Danefield, but I know what you took. Return the funds, or I'll see you ruined." He set the letter down. "It's dated a week before his death." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. "How very revealing," she said softly. "Clara, then, was more than a maid to Mr. Vane. Did she admit to anything?" "Not yet," Craddock replied, "but we also found traces of cyanide in a jar in her room, labelled as cleaning powder. But it's the same substance as the vial in the churchyard. We're bringing her in for questioning today." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. The letter confirmed a connection between Clara and Vane, one rooted in a past misdeed. She recalled a village girl, years ago, who had stolen from an employer and lived in fear of exposure. "Clara's youth makes her impulsive," she said, "but fear can drive even the timid to desperate acts." "And Tom Reed, what of him?" Craddock's expression darkened. "He's been evasive, but we know he has access to medical supplies through Dr. Haydock. We're searching his lodgings now." Miss Marple leaned forward, her tone gentle but firm. "Inspector, might I suggest you ask Clara about her time in South America? The letter suggests she knew Vane before Danefield, and Tom Reed, his involvement may be more than loyalty to a sweetheart." Craddock raised an eyebrow, accustomed to her subtle nudges. "I'll do that. You've a knack for seeing what we miss, Miss Marple." That afternoon, Miss Marple lingered near the manor's garden, where the roses drooped under the weight of autumn's chill. She had no intention of eavesdropping, but her presence often went unnoticed, a gift of age and unassuming demeanour. As she bent to admire a late bloom, she overheard voices from the manor's back door. Clara, her tone sharp with panic, speaking to Mrs. Price. "I didn't mean for it to happen," Clara said, her voice breaking. "He was going to tell everyone." Mrs. Price's reply was low, soothing. "Hush, Clara. Say nothing more. The police will handle it." The door closed and Miss Marple straightened, her mind cataloguing the exchange. Clara's words were a confession, however veiled, but Mrs. Price's response suggested ignorance rather than complicity. By evening, Inspector Craddock summoned Miss Marple to the station, where Clara sat, her face pale and tear-streaked. Tom Reed stood nearby, his jaw tight, his hands cuffed. Craddock's voice was grim. Clara broke down under questioning. She admitted to poisoning Vane's cocoa. She was his secretary in Peru, handling accounts for his mining venture. She appropriated funds, thinking he wouldn't notice. When he returned to England and recognized her at the manor, he demanded repayment, threatening to expose her. Miss Marple's eyes softened with understanding. "And Tom Reed?" she asked. "He supplied the cyanide," Craddock said. "Stole it from Dr. Haydock's stores. He claims he did it to protect Clara, believing Vane's threats would ruin her. They acted together, though Clara insists she alone laced the cocoa." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts aligning. Fear is a powerful motive, Inspector. Clara saw no way out, and Tom, poor boy, thought he was saving her. She recalled a young couple from her past, driven to theft by desperation, their love blinding them to consequence. "Mrs. Price, I take it, knew nothing of this." "Nothing," Craddock confirmed. "Her connection to Vane was a red herring. Her fear came from the scandal, not guilt. The will was a surprise to her, and we've verified she had no contact with Vane since their engagement ended." Miss Marple's needles, resting in her basket, seemed to beckon, but she left them untouched. The puzzle was complete. Clara, driven by fear of exposure, had poisoned Vane's cocoa, using cyanide procured by Tom Reed. The vial in the churchyard, the letter, the nervous glances, all pointed to a desperate act by a young woman trapped by her past. Mrs. Price, though linked to Vane by history, was innocent, her anxiety born of the chaos in her home. As Clara and Tom were led away, Miss Marple stood, her expression one of quiet sorrow. "It's always the young ones who surprise us," she said softly. "They act on impulse, not seeing the shadows they cast." Craddock escorted her to the door, his tone grateful. "Your insights made the difference, Miss Marple. Without your nudge, we might have focused too long on Mrs. Price." She smiled faintly. "I only see what's there, Inspector. People are so very predictable, yet so very human." As she stepped into the cool evening air, her thoughts lingered on Clara's tearful confession, Tom's misguided loyalty, and the tragedy of a single cup of cocoa. The truth had emerged, as it always did, from the quiet corners of Danefield's unassuming lanes. Chapter 8. The Village Settles. The soft hush of late autumn descended upon Danefield, wrapping the village in a quiet that felt both restorative and fragile. The leaves, now mostly fallen, carpeted the lanes in shades of amber and crimson, and the air carried the faint tang of bonfires from distant fields. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her cottage on Willow Lane, gazed out at the familiar scene, her knitting needles moving with their usual steady rhythm. The tragedy at Danefield Manor had receded into the village's collective memory. though its echoes lingered in the cautious glances of neighbours and the subdued chatter at the shop. The truth about Lawrence Vane's death, so sharply unveiled, had left Danefield altered, yet determined to reclaim its tranquillity. The arrest of Clara and Tom Reed had sent ripples through the village, stirring a mix of shock and pity. Clara, the quiet maid with her downcast eyes, and Tom, the earnest assistant to Dr. Haydock, had seemed an unlikely pair for such a desperate act. Yet the evidence, the letter from Vane, the vial of cyanide, Clara's tearful confession, had been undeniable. Miss Marple, reflecting on the outcome, felt a familiar pang of sorrow for youth led astray by fear. She recalled a case from her early days in St. Mary Mead, where a young man's rash decision had ended in tragedy, his good intentions unravelling under the weight of consequence. "Fear," she murmured to Pippin, her cat who lounged by the hearth, "is a cruel master." Mrs. Eleanor Price, cleared of suspicion, had become a figure of quiet sympathy in the village. The revelation of her brief engagement to Vane, coupled with the unexpected bequest in his will, had fueled gossip. But Miss Marple sensed the widow's relief outweighed her embarrassment. A week after Clara's arrest, Mrs. Price announced her intention to sell Danefield Manor and return to London, seeking a fresh start away from the whispers and memories. Miss Marple, calling to bid her farewell, found her in the morning room, packing books into a crate. The photograph of a younger Eleanor with Vane was gone, replaced by a vase of late roses. "You've been kind, Miss Marple," Mrs. Price said, her voice steadier than before. "I never imagined such a thing could happen here. Lawrence's death, it brought back so much I'd tried to forget." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes gentle. "The past has a way of finding us, doesn't it? But you'll find peace in London, I'm sure." She did not mention the will, though she wondered if Mrs. Price would accept Vane's bequest, or let it pass to the cousin in Canada. Some questions, she knew, were best left unanswered. The village, too, sought to move forward. Mr. Clement threw himself into preparations for the harvest festival, his sermons taking on a hopeful note about forgiveness and renewal. Griselda, ever irrepressible, organised a bazaar to raise funds for the church roof, her laughter a balm to the village's bruised spirit. Miss Lavinia Blake, though disappointed that the scandal had not implicated a grander figure, found new material in the upcoming wedding of the butcher's daughter. Dr. Haydock, shaken by Tom Reed's betrayal, resumed his rounds with a gruff determination, though Miss Marple noted a new wariness in his eyes. Inspector Craddock, before returning to his duties in the county, paid a final visit to Miss Marple's cottage. Over tea, he shared the last details of the case. "Clara's trial is set for next month," he said, stirring his cup. "She's pleaded guilty, and Tom's likely to do the same. They're young, Miss Marple. Too young for such a mistake to ruin them forever. The judge may show leniency." "I hope so," Miss Marple replied, her tone soft. "They acted out of fear, not malice. Clara thought Vane's threats would destroy her, and Tom believed he was protecting her. Love, Inspector, can make us terribly foolish." She paused, her needles clicking. "It's a pity Vane didn't show more mercy. A word of forgiveness might have changed everything." Craddock smiled, accustomed to her wisdom. "You saw it all before we did, Miss Marple. That letter, Clara's nerves, even Tom's involvement, you pointed us to the truth without saying it outright." She waved a hand dismissively. "I only notice what's there, Inspector. People are so very predictable, yet their hearts surprise us. She thought of Clara's desperate act, Tom's misguided loyalty, and the quiet courage of Mrs. Price, who had faced suspicion with dignity. As the days passed, Danefield settled into its familiar rhythm. The manor stood empty, its windows dark, awaiting a new occupant. Miss Marple resumed her routine, gardening, knitting, and the subtle observation of her neighbours. A misplaced letter at the post office caught her attention one morning, hinting at a small mystery involving the vicarage's new curate. She smiled to herself, tucking the detail away for another day. That evening, as the fire crackled in her cottage, Miss Marple sat with Pippin curled beside her. The village was quiet, its secrets laid bare, its wounds beginning to heal. Life, she said softly to the cat, is like a skein of wool, full of tangles, but it comes right if you're patient. She picked up her knitting, the soft click of needles filling the room, and turned her thoughts to the next small puzzle Danefield might offer.